Emerald Eyes by T.J.E. Hostetter. I've never been one to try and make waves. I've always preferred the comfort of security. It was my motive throughout my school years and why I work the career I currently have. I will admit that I do have a strangely high curiosity, but I've forced myself over the years to learn how to control it. However, recently it's begun to grow stronger, and after what I may have just learned, it really took hold of me, and I may have to relearn how to control it. I was overseeing the demolition of a small town in the state of Montana called McNab. It was an old farming town founded in the 1800s by German immigrants. Other than that, there was little history. It had been abandoned for many decades. The rumors I first heard were actually that it was possibly built too close to a nuclear dig site, so everyone either left or just died out. It was this rumor that was part of the reason we were going in to salvage everything, so perhaps nuclear companies could come in and remove it. As it turns out, there were small traces of radiation throughout McNab, but not enough that anyone could possibly be dramatically affected, and definitely not enough to suggest that there could be any uranium or something worth mining. Other than that, I assumed there was nothing truly interesting about McNab. I was drastically mistaken. On the surface, it was no different than any other town I had visited, but interestingly, the town had a chain of tunnels in a few spots that seemed to lead to a series of rooms. Like the rest of the town, these rooms had been abandoned, the only inhabitants being a few mice or probably other creatures looking for shelter. It was rather strange, for there were no clues as to what purpose these tunnels served back in the day, and relaying the information to my superiors would probably mean the tunnels would have to be dug up and removed as well. However, this is where my curiosity started to flare. I was fortunate enough to be able to track down and interview several people who had lived in McNab all those years ago. Some were adults who lived there as children, but most were elders who were born and raised there, at least until they were forced to move after the rumors of the radiation. However, it was not the rumors of radiation that forced the elderly out of McNab. Many of the younger adults told me similar things, like moving away for a job or the hope of a better life. What the elders told me was far more curious. I didn't want to jump to any conclusions after one or two interviews, so I took notes for each one and planned to put the pieces together later. It wasn't until I met a man by the name of Jonathan Gray that something truly strange happened. Mr. Gray was an elder, and was actually a big name in McNab at one point in time. He told me the same curious stories that the other elders had told me. What made this one different was he provided me with a journal. I don't know if it was because he was ready to let go of what he had seen, or if it was out of sheer terror that haunted him for decades, but he willingly gave me the journal after the interview, telling me it belonged to an associate of his back in the day, named Anthony F. Gould. I tried to find this Mr. Gould himself, but in my investigation, I learned that not only had he been dead for 20 years, but he had died in a mental hospital after being beaten to death by other patients. After fulfilling my duties and providing the necessary information to my superiors so they could begin salvage, I gathered my notes and read over Gould's journal. What I read actually disturbed me more than any interview, but not for the reasons one may think. From my interviews, I had learned that Gould must have been a cruel man. It took some time, some additional research, and a lot of paperwork, and even his own words capitalized on just how wicked he really was in life. It took some time, some additional research, and a lot of paperwork, if I'm being honest, but I believe I've figured out what truly happened to McNab and Gould. This is what I've come to conclude. If I go way back, it started in the early 1950s. The exact date, or even the reason for this, is unknown. Within that time frame, McNab had formed some kind of underground society going by the name the Webbers. I use the word underground because that's what the tunnels and rooms were for. It seemed like everyone in town not only knew about it, but was associated with it, whether they wanted to be or not. It wasn't known to the rest of the state or the country, as isolation was a key feature of McNab, and probably one of the reasons the Webbers were able to form in the first place. The name came from its founding leader, Hans Weber, one of the priests at the time, which led me to believe that the creation of the Webbers started for religious reasons. There were not many stories of what Weber did in his time as the group's leader, but it was very well known that Ghoul would come to surpass and overthrow him. Ghoul came to power in the late 60s, not a religious figure himself, but an ambitious businessman with a desire to control this group. What followed was many stories of how Ghoul ran the Webbers. Some of the jobs he did seemed simple enough, like ensuring a certain amount of a specific crop was grown each season. My interviews led me to believe that simple stories like those had mostly been forgotten. What was mostly told to me and written in the journal were more stories about how Ghoul forced people to do things. In 1972, he forced farmers to give up 1/4 of their crops to him without even telling them what it was for, and give another 1/4 to feed the cattle, claiming it would produce healthier milk and better meat. According to one of my interviews, a Miss Dorothy B. Moore told me at the time that her husband couldn't afford to give up half his crop, and as punishment, Ghoul ordered the sabotage of several pieces of farming equipment, which ultimately ended with the family having to sell the farm to Ghoul. Other stories were not so much about power and profit, but more just random acts of bullying, for the lack of better words. In 1974, Ghoul ordered a man by the name of Gerald Hikes to vandalize his own workplace by painting absurd graffiti on the windows. Hikes was lucky enough to not get caught by his boss. About a year later, he gave another job to Hikes. He was to go to the library and push the bookshelves over, creating a domino effect. That time he was caught and had to miss work doing community service cleaning up the library. There were many more stories like these. Every single elder I interviewed told me that at least once Ghoul forced them to purchase something for him. Many times they didn't have time or money to spare on an object like cigarettes, and they were always objects he could afford on his own. The only exception to this was Mr. Gray. Gray worked with Ghoul long before he came to power. He told me he never really liked working for Ghoul, but he didn't have much of a choice since he had a family to feed. After all, the evil he saw Ghoul doing, for random reasons, he couldn't afford to risk loss of employment or worse. I wondered at first why Gray even kept the journal and did not destroy it, or perhaps hand it over to the state authorities. It wasn't hard to figure it out. The system of power that Ghoul held over everyone in McNab was mostly about the flow of information, as Ghoul would tell someone something and make sure that specific people didn't know. It worked well to Ghoul's benefit that even the sheriff and the deputy couldn't do anything about it, for Ghoul eventually hired a few thugs to help enforce his rule. This is how it was for over 10 years. 10 years of Ghoul's cruel and wicked tyranny. Even the one who was supposedly closest to him, Mr. Gray, hated and feared him. What came next, I find very hard to believe. I would write it off as urban legend, or perhaps small-town folklore, but every single one of my interviewed elders and the journal itself points to something truly strange. I will probably be deemed a fool, or perhaps even mad by what I'm about to say. But this is what I have, so if this is just a hoax, then it was a well-made one that fooled an entire small town on population and drove the town into abandonment. At the turn of the decade, in 1980, a new face arrived in McNab. News traveled fast of this stranger, as such things tend to do in small towns. According to my sources, the stranger was a man named Richter Herschel. He was a fiction writer of decent reputation, even earning an honorary Ph.D. for his bestsellers. He moved to McNab for his mother as she was terminally ill, and he wanted to take care of her until her passing. He also hoped to escape city life for a short while and get some new writing in. He didn't look different than anyone else, except for people noted that his eyes were an unusually bright green, almost like emeralds. People also questioned the fact that he looked nothing like Miss Herschel. He claimed that she was unable to bear a child herself, so he was adopted. My interviews all described Richter the same way, that he was a rather calm and quiet man. He wasn't social, but he always treated strangers with respect and rarely failed to have proper manners for even the simplest of things. He wasn't rich for his bestsellers, but he made a good living off of it, so he never really needed to do much else for money. One of the younger adults I interviewed, Helen Poola, told me that Richter actually helped her with English homework occasionally, and she became a fan of his books. After his mother passed and her body was laid to rest, Richter stayed in McNab. It was then that Gould decided to act. Gould called a meeting and invited Richter. Ignorant of what was happening, Richter attended, only to have the Webbers reveal their wicked intentions. Richter, to many of their surprises, was unintimidated. Gould first tried something simple, like ordering Richter to buy him a pack of cigarettes, but Richter apparently responded with, "Smoking's not good for you," and went off. Word spread about Richter's refusal to conform to Gould, and this made Gould both angry and worried. Despite Gould's influence, Richter was hard to control, since no one really knew much about him. Gould first ordered Gray to vandalize his home. However, that didn't work, as the house Richter was staying in, his mother's house, was on the outskirts of McNab, had a metal fence, and Richter was often seen outside at night stargazing, and in the day, when one thought a night owl would be asleep, Richter was seen awake, eating his meals or writing in his notebook on the porch. When Gray finally managed to catch a moment where Richter wasn't looking, he broke every window in the house. Richter gave no response. He was seen cleaning the glass and then covering them with sheets. Next, Gould tried to turn the town against Richter, but that hardly mattered since he kept to himself. The only thing it did affect was that Helen wasn't allowed to get help with her homework from Richter. This distrust of Richter didn't last long, as people started to question and to disobey Gould more often. Hearing of someone who wouldn't fall in line seemed to spur rebellious thoughts. Since Gould had the sheriff in his pocket, he tried to get him on Richter, but Richter, being as smart as he was, knew the law well, something he must have picked up in his university days. And since the only thing he seemed to do was disobey Gould, the sheriff couldn't do anything for the tyrant. In fact, the only thing that happened was Richter scolded the sheriff, calling him a coward. Gould tried everything, threatening phone calls, but Richter never answered. He ordered Gray to slash his tires, but Richter walked everywhere. The new man was a mountain, refusing to be moved. At this point, Gould would normally threaten a family member, but the only family Richter had was already 6 feet under. He had nothing to lose, and therefore nothing to fear. But Gould had something to fear. People were disobeying him more and more, and a horrible thought occurred to him. If Richter finally decided to move away, he could tell the authorities and expose the Webbers. While he never had resorted to violence, he was going to make an exception. The plan was to accuse Richter of something that back then was so taboo and looked down upon that people often used it as an excuse to hurt others. Rumors started to spread that Richter was a homosexual, and that's why he was antisocial. He was living in the closet. Based on my interviews, few people actually believed this, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the rumors were there, and the reason for violence was there. One summer night, a group of Gould's men stalked Richter. The plan was to find him and make an example of him. The next morning, Gould's men were rushed to the hospital. Each of them had suffered from horrible beatings. They were covered in lacerations, and some had collapsed lungs. While they had all survived, They couldn't talk for days, and when they finally could, they were so horrified they couldn't bring themselves to speak of whatever had happened to them. The same day, Ghoul received a phone call. He recorded it all in his journal, as if every word spoken from Richter's mouth was carved into his brain. You truly couldn't let it go, could you, Ghoul? You and your hunger for power. Is that really how weak you are? Are you truly that cruel? That you have to bully everyone you possibly can? I'm going to tell you this, that you are playing with forces your weak mind cannot even dream to comprehend. So drop this little game of yours if you value your well-being. I find myself questioning if everything told to me was true. Even after all the people I spoke to and the nightmarish writing of this journal, how could it all be real? This whole thing is starting to sound more like a bad dream, or perhaps a work of fiction. But it's what happened next that seems the most surreal and truly difficult to believe. Part of me wishes that Ghoul would have listened. I don't know why he didn't. Even Gray didn't know why. Based on what Gray told me, and from the writing of the journal, I can only believe that Ghoul's ego was just too inflated, and perhaps even God couldn't make him stop what he was doing. That being said, I have no pity for what happened to him next. After weeks of doing nothing, Ghoul once again called a meeting. His grip on McNab's people was the weakest it had ever been. This time he demanded Richter come and face him. According to the journal, he did something very different which worked temporarily. Ghoul threatened to do wrong against Helen Pola's family, the child that Richter had tutored prior to her not being allowed to speak to him. However, she told me that she and Richter had some contact. My guess is it was the little rebellious nature that all children have. Helen was spared a lot of the horrible details, as she had no idea her family was at any risk. Despite this ignorance from Helen, it worked on getting Richter to come. Ghoul had ordered his remaining men, and even the sheriff and deputy, to be with him when the time came. They were each armed with guns. The only one who wasn't armed was Gray. He was just there as an observer. Gray took his time telling me about this part. He spoke very slowly and careful, but he did so in strange detail, and after hearing it, I could understand why. Once Richter arrived, he had a deadly look in his eyes. His eyes looked like two glowing emeralds. Some words were exchanged, but Gray knew how it was going to play out. All the men raised their weapons against Richter, despite his cryptic and strange warnings, but before anyone could open fire, all the guns were suddenly ripped from their hands and into the air by unseen appendages. Each one was ripped apart like rotten wood. Everyone looked in horror as Richter gave a wicked smile and a maddening laugh. His body started to twist and shift. Gray heard what sounded like bones breaking and reforming again and again. When the transformation was done, Richter, or whatever kind of creature he had become, possessed the figure of a wolf standing on its back legs. Its dark purple skin was like that of an octopus with glowing blue rings. His arms had lines of spikes and sharp claws. A pair of large bat-like wings with talons and a long bladed tail emerged from his back. Finally, his head was that of some kind of beast, with long, pointed ears, two curved horns like that of a bull. His eyes were still that emerald green. At this point, Gray blacked out for a moment. I don't blame him. After he came to his senses, everyone in the room, except Ghoul and himself, was on the ground with the same bruising and lacerations as from before. He couldn't tell if they were dead or not. He looked towards the creature. It held Ghoul by his shoulder, and it was running its claw down his face. Did you really think you would escape? Did you really think that you could keep going on about living the life of evil and tormenting people for sick games? Did you really think it would not come back to find you, and that you could just go on living the way you do? What say you, little devil? Now that all your evil has come to collect you, are you ready to pay the price? What say you, little devil? Ghoul had no words. The creature then stared into his eyes, letting out a nightmarish hissing sound. Ghoul started to panic like a madman, flailing his body trying to escape the creature's grasp. But suddenly he stopped. He froze and was motionless. The creature dropped him on the floor. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. Gray believed he was next, that the creature was going to punish him for his sins, for all the evil he had done to innocent people, all because he was too afraid to stand up against Ghoul. The creature looked at him, but it just stared. It didn't attack. It didn't do anything. It just turned around and left. Gray never found out why Richter had spared him, but he couldn't get the images out of his mind. They were forever part of him, and they were probably his motive for what he did next. That morning, Richter was gone, never seen in McNab again. Gray was the first to leave. As soon as he could, he packed up and his family left. He never saw McNab or Ghoul ever again. He ended up becoming a railroad worker. I'm also guessing he tried to redeem himself, as he went on to do many different charity works, ranging from helping children's hospitals to raising money to improve homeless shelters. Perhaps that's why Richter spared him. Gray was the only one interviewed who specifically told me of what happened that night. The rest were just rumors, but each rumor was connected to the story. That Richter had done something, or was something, that pushed Ghoul over the edge. Over time, people just started leaving. I heard from one young adult named Sarah Dio that the sheriff and deputy died in the hospital, but no one knew what had attacked them. It's that unknown that probably made the rumors strong enough for people to leave. As for Ghoul, he ended up in an asylum for a few years. His journal entries stopped happening for a while, until closer to the end, when they started to escalate into what I can only call madness. The dates matched the hospital reports I found, suggesting that he checked himself in. I can believe that the Webbers was a real cult, and that Ghoul was an evil tyrant, but a monster, something out of a horror film, arriving virtually out of nowhere and suddenly becoming an unlikely hero. The thought is absurd. However, as I previously mentioned, I do have a strong curiosity about things. I ended up researching Richter Herschel. As it turns out, he was indeed a best-selling author. I actually read a book of his in middle school without realizing it. I wanted to find him and ask him if it was all true, at my own risk, I guess. However, he passed away 6 years ago. He did marry and had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. I was able to get a meeting with his eldest daughter, Bailey Herschel, and she indeed has bright emerald eyes. I tried to keep the interviews subtle and realistic, but my interest in the story slipped out. So she showed me something. It looked like some kind of blanket, about the size of an infant, but it was made of something that I can only describe as a cross between silk and glass, covered with strange symbols like hieroglyphs. What she said next, I'd never forget. The meteor fell, and this is what he was wrapped in when my grandmother found him that night. This is a T.J.E. Hostetter fantasy. Thank you.